stuff, and I apologize in advance. The interesting thing about this satellite photograph is that it captures the 4th largest city in the United Arab Emirates. About 1970, at exactly the time that a modern city is going to unceremoniously and somewhat disastrously eclipse a city that has been standing here for about 4,000 years. It's a trading post at an oasis. And let me just identify some of these elements here. So here is the sacred mountain, and this is the dry river bed called the Wadi. And the dark area is the oasis, which is the reason that this city is here in the first place. You see all 3 of those in this photograph here, and a photograph of the oasis. And most interestingly, what you see here is the harbinger of the modern city. This is a boulevard that's going to course through a city of what will become about 500,000 people. And then these are enormous traffic circles. It's hard to get a measure of their scale at this point. Within a couple years of this satellite being taken, this satellite photo being taken, there are going to be super blocks in LA that are up to like half a mile long. There are going to be boulevards that are 80 yards from face to face of the buildings. The city is going to have ambitions that honestly are going to make you blush. And water will be brought from the Arabian Gulf, desalinized, and the desert is going to bloom just like they said it was going to bloom. So, 40 years after the photograph was taken, the city still, to my eyes, looks like a garden. Some of the super blocks, however, are beginning to look a little bit like Potemkin villages. So here, for example, is a picture on the ground in the middle of one of the super blocks. It's taken from about this point here in this half-mile block. This photograph is the counterpart of this picture. In the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, there are birthright lots given to Emirati citizens, and they're usually at the metastasizing edge of the city, or at the edge of the red dunes of the desert that mean so much to Emiratis. And it is for reasons of this photograph of these birthright lots that you have this picture, because a lot of the people who now live on the edge of the city used to live in blocks like this. And so, again, 40 years after that satellite image was taken, Dpz was asked to come to Al Ain and do a master plan, and they were asked to try and figure out how to bring Emiratis back into the center of the city. No small thing given the politics. Just to give you a sense of the scale, the 2 super blocks that we work most on are at the top. The High Al Humaira is overlaid on Seaside. At the bottom, Seaside is about half a mile long, so that gives you a sense of the scale. And then the other super block, Al Madif, is overlaid on Dubrovnik, which I think has 2,000 dwelling units and about 5,000 people, plus the full complement of public institutions. So you get a sense when you do these of the capacity of these super blocks. These are pretty standard diagrams that help you try and get a toehold on how you might get started planning these things. In the upper left is a diagram of the hierarchy of the streets. The primary streets are based on existing curb cuts and traffic light locations. You've got ownership maps, you've got demolition maps, and they give you some indication of how you might phase such a large project. But the one that I really want to draw to your attention is this one over here. Abu Dhabi's Planning Council has deemed that every development parcel in Abu Dhabi is to self-park. And what it means is that the scale of these existing buildings, which are about 15 by 20 meters around the edges of these, they wanted Dpz to maintain the small scale of the city because they consider themselves to be the counterpart of the profligate cities on the coast. But at the same time, in demanding that there be a subgrade parking on site, they have more or less guaranteed that the new buildings will have to be much larger than the existing buildings. Second of all, part of the idea of the master plan was to incentivize the demolition of all the buildings around the perimeter of these blocks. And by requiring new development parcels to have self-parking, they will saddle them with an expense that virtually guarantees that they will not get built and that the buildings that they're supposed to take place of will not get torn down. A roof plan of the ultimate phase at the bottom, and a view of the interior of the block from here. You can see that the perimeter buildings are about 5 stories, and the prevailing height in here is 2 to 3 stories. This Middle East work means an awful lot to me. It's the closest that I've ever had a chance to sort of think of a modern tradition from the ground up. And my impression of the Middle East, and particularly the Arabian Peninsula, is that the situation over there is incredibly fluid, that the ground is contestable, and that it's really worth trying to be in the ballgame and come off the sidelines on all this. More views of the central space. You can see that the attempt here is to break up the massing in the buildings so that the scale of even large buildings will be consistent with what the city of Al Ain wanted. The second superblock that we worked on is really a counter-proposal. The largest developer in the UAE commissioned this study for a block that's largely taken up by a single estate. It's about 1.9 million square feet, and it has no realistic roads through the middle of it. It's got thousands of parking spaces buried somewhere underneath this, but I don't quite understand it. It also has buildings that go up to 9 stories tall, which is much taller than what the city of Al Ain wanted. So our counter-proposal, first and foremost, was intended to try and accommodate the same number of square feet under the development guidelines that Dpz was establishing, to put real streets through here, real services, and to not exceed the height limits of Al Ain, which is 5 stories. We came within 2 or 3% of being able to do that. These are some massing diagrams. Again, it's about 1.9 million square feet over the entire superblock. The transportation engineers deemed that a site right here on the corner of Al Madif would be perfect for the high-speed train station that would connect Al Ain with Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And so we undertook to accommodate that on the same block. You can see the track overruns, which are here. We had to replace a mosque over the near part of the track overruns. So the train station, we looked at basically 2 sorts of ideas. One is the top-lit quality of the cross-section of the ruins of Trajan's markets, which are at the top right here. And the other idea, I think, probably came from a lithograph that David Roberts did in his series of lithographs of Cairo, which is simply that a market took place underneath a street that was covered over. And so the reflected ceiling plan shows the Cairo strategy, and this shows more or less the idea of a top-lit space similar to Trajan's markets. Cutaway section axons and worm's eye views of how the cross-section works. And then at the top, the interior, again, is 2 thin parallel buildings that have between them a roofed-over space that comprises the terminal. And then a view of the terminal from one of the main boulevards in the evening. Okay, this next project was done with Dpz for Mecca. It was housing, and I'm going to fly through this stuff. But right on the edge, there's a highway that connects Jeddah and Mecca. And as you approach Mecca, there's a gate, which you can see over the highway here. The Dpz site is all of this. They also planned the northern side of this interchange as well. But this is what I'm going to concentrate on. The area right inside this black circle is the area inside the red and orange shapes over here. And this is a rendering of further detail of it with all the footprints of the different buildings. Dpz had a team of architects from all over the country, and we were just a small part of it. So the 3 or 4 projects that I want to show you are here, here, and here. We'll start with this one, we'll go to these 2, and then we'll go to the smallest one here. This is an eye-level view of the largest building, and the building in the foreground has been removed so that you can see the courtyard side of it. Boulevards in Saudi Arabian development are enormous, and they're overscaled, and often it's the mid-block side that's much more interesting. And so we obviously try to mitigate the size of these buildings by breaking down the massing a little bit and stepping it down on the courtyard side. The ramp down to the subgrade parking is right here where it really shouldn't be seen. There's a view here that's a high version of the view that I just showed you, so you can see the courtyard. The alleyways are often more interesting, and they're certainly more intimately scaled than the boulevards. There's the detail of the roof line, roof plan, and one of the boulevard elevations. Again, I think the boulevard elevation of these two is not quite as interesting. This is the boulevard elevation of the next two. This is an aerial view over the middle of the block of a mid-block building and then an L-shaped building on a corner. The mid-block building is H-shaped and it's right here, and the other one is right here. Now, I'm not going to be able to explain these buildings in the amount of time that we have, but I would just point out that the mid-block building is basically an H-shaped building at the upper levels, and you can see that there are 6 units per floor here. The core is right here. There's 2 means of egress, and air is pulled between those. So you've got a relatively short hall that's connecting 6 different units. This is the one that's kind of most interesting to me because I can imagine it in Miami Beach on one of those high coverage lots where you have very, very small setbacks, about a few blocks off of the ocean. So those courtyard apartments in Miami are always unsatisfying because they've got balconies or continuous corridors around the inside, thus depriving you of any kind of real privacy. And if you look to the outside of the building, the next building is so close that it seems mean. So this building is meant to try and address that basic problem. Here, these buildings are only 4 meters apart, and so the real privacy that we've tried to give them is within the courtyard here. Parking requirements were relatively lenient. We only needed 1 parking space per unit, and this parking in the back of the ground floor is accessed off of the alleyway. On the upper 3 floors, again, there are 4 relatively large 2-bedroom units and a relatively short hallway or corridor so that the corridor is not passing all the units. And the main exposure of the 2 back units is to the courtyard. Okay, so during the course of the development of the Mecca housing, we took a breather, and both Dpz and our office undertook to do a competition for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 million square feet, I don't know, and we had 2 weeks in which to do it. And the way I saw it was a sort of a chance to build on the Mecca work, but work with Dpz's much more interesting streets and much more agile development parcels. It was also incredibly liberating to have to make a lot of decisions on a lot of square footage very quickly. Dpz came up with a diagram where a major central space was approached from 2 different directions, roughly at right angles. And we worked primarily on the approach to the central space from one side. The view that you see on the left over here basically looks through a series of courtyards in the hotel that's at the bottom of the street and looks up the street as it narrows and rises up over 2 and then 3 levels of subgrade parking. The subgrade parking was incredibly unrealistic and would probably be the undoing of the project. So the typical block was about 75 or 80 meters. We planned it as double-loaded buildings that could have been either housing or office or mixed-use space. You can probably see a little bit of the debt to the Dammam work or the Mecca work that was going on at the same time. The section here shows it over 2 levels of subgrade parking. Each courtyard has a means of bringing some light into that subgrade parking. There's also a circulation system that allows you to circulate from courtyard to courtyard to courtyard, which is a secondary means of pedestrian circulation. At the top of the street is the second hotel site. The 2 red arrows show you where the views are taken from. The top view, this view is from the slotted space over here, looking across the main central space to the forecourt of the hotel. And then this view is taken from within the hotel's forecourt view, looking out onto the large central space. I have Stockholm City Hall's courtyard arcade here because it's very similar in the way it connects the captured courtyard space and looks out to the water. Okay, closer to home, this project was not commissioned. It's something that we did, should I say, for fun. It's close to Charleston. It's essentially the last phase of ION, the 11th phase, and we did it about the time we were waiting to see where Hurricane Matthew would hit the East Coast. And it's a very good development parcel. The infrastructure is already here. Unfortunately, the entitlements for developing further lots in this phase were not there. They had been used up in the first. Too bad, because this is an obvious development site with all the infrastructure already in place here. And if you put 30 or 40 houses someplace else on a more sensitive site, it would definitely be to the detriment of some other parcel. The best thing that you can do, architects sort of work the margins of political processes, and the best thing I think that you can do is try and put forward forms of development that are, as I said before, disarming or even somewhat inspiring. The blocks in this particular 4-acre parcel are enormous, and it's a problem common to Charleston, where you often have such big blocks that the middle of the block is underused. And in fact, the developer of ION is doing a project over on the peninsula of Charleston, and it's one of the projects that we looked at as a precedent. So Vince Graham is doing something called Morris Square, where he's reorganizing the interior of one of Charleston's enormous blocks. And he's having a primary exposure for mid-block houses onto a small mid-block park. There are other places that do this really in intriguing ways, plus Furstenberg in Paris is one of my favorite examples, 70 feet on a side, relatively small. This one's less relevant. But the Beguinage, which I know a lot of people in this room are interested in, were another mid-block example where with an enormous city block, you could have primary exposures to a commons inside the block. So we did two, the red arrow up here shows where the view is taken from. The developer had this idea that this narrow sewer easement here could flare out and widen into a really nice mid-block space here. And so we developed versions of their idea for these two variants, top and bottom. And then we did a slightly larger space in this version. And with each version, we looked at different ways of having fee simple and detached houses forming this space. We looked at combinations of row houses, attached row houses, and even apartments and condominiums. Okay, Alice Beach, we first started working at Alice Beach about 10 years ago, before the recession. And we did 4 very thin buildings at the principal intersection. And those buildings can be seen right here at the corner of 30A and Somerset Street, which goes from the woods to the Gulf of Mexico down here. Whenever I see these designs, I'm reminded of the fact that the world has totally changed since we started working at Alice Beach. These buildings are thin, they're probably 32 to 40 feet wide. Many of the units go all the way through, so they have not only great light, but great ventilation. There aren't cores with long hallways, but there's a lot of vertical cores. In every regard, they're generous and unrealistic. And I don't think that even at a place like Alice Beach, you're going to be able to afford to build buildings like this anymore. Dpz Master Plan, again, I think the most interesting thing about the plan is the fact that you have a vehicular street, and then you have parking courts, and then you have a pedestrian street, and you have parking courts again, and then you have another vehicular street. And this pattern reproduces itself from east to west through Alice Beach. It's a fantastic and beautiful plan. The pedestrian streets you can see here and here. And then if you need evidence that parking lots can be beautiful, here is what one of the parking courts looks like. So spaces like this, 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 or this. We undertook last winter to study the entire amphitheater area, which is now their large public space. We looked at different densities. We looked at ways you might enter from the residential areas, residential neighborhoods to the north. We looked at how you might handle the enormously wide right-of-way of 30A, which is 130 feet across. And then we did more detailed studies of 2 buildings, a compact mixed-use building here and a slightly elongated one here. The view over on the top left is a slotted space that would have you coming into the big space from the north. This is a view of half of the 130-foot right-of-way. So the travel lane is here, the slip lanes are here for parking, And the clients decided that of all the combinations we studied, that they wanted to have a combination of low and high buildings, which I think was a good decision. This is the building that we are working on now that's going through pricing, and which we hope will be under construction in the spring. It is a relatively compact building at 70 by 90 feet, so it's very different than the thin buildings that we had done 10 years ago there. It's a mixed-use building of apartments over, condominiums over a restaurant on the ground floor. So the plan, again, in contrast to the stuff we did pre-recession, 70 feet by 90 feet with a relatively small core here, about 85% net to gross, which is a measure that developers want to see to make sure that the building is efficient. And the elevation from 30A at the top, the elevation from the alleyway here, the elevation of the amphitheater here, and here's a cross-section through the 30A right-of-way with the travel lane here, the slip lanes on either side of it. And just to show you what that might look like, the other side of the 30A right-of-way now with the travel lane on the left side and the slip lane here. Our building is right here. This building exists. It's by Eric Boat and Marion. And they are in the process of topping this building out. So there is the chance that this building will have a pretty mature setting when it's finished. And a detail of it. Apparently everybody in Vero Beach, or in Alice Beach, is young and elegant. Second to last project here. Remember I showed you an overlay of one of the super blocks of Al Lane overlaid on Seaside. This time the same super block is overlaid on Miracle Mile, which I described for you in the opening remarks. 40 acres, let's say, of nothing but surface parking right here. This is that bridge that I just talked about crossing over and seeing the estuary for 10 miles to the north. This project that I want to describe for you is a 5-acre parcel just on the northern edge of Miracle Mile. And part of what we were thinking of in doing this project was that because the zoning was the same for that 5-acre parcel as it was for Miracle Mile, that we would experiment with what kind of densities and scales you could have if you used the full FAR and height limit that you were allowed under existing zoning without asking for any variances. So the parcel is 5 acres. It's sort of an L-shaped parcel, 100,000 square foot program, and the odd thing is that there's a parking garage in this, which is anathema in Vero Beach. If you have a parking garage that's open, it doesn't count towards FAR, and this is the sort of dilemma, because if a parking garage is unattractive, you have to make it readily evident in order for it to not count against what you are trying to do with the land. And the first phase is on the left here. You can see all the water in Florida. Retaining stormwater is a huge part of the use of open land. Vero Beach has its own requirements for open land, but the construction of this parking garage made it possible to design a campus where every office looked out onto a garden. By the way, this is a city of 15,000 people, Vero Beach, the city proper. If you were to take this pattern of development and extend it over the entirety of the 40 acres of Miracle Mile, you would have about 800,000 square feet of space. You would be able to have apartments for about 800 people. You would be able to have offices for 3,000 to 4,000 people, any mix of those two that you wanted to have. This is a street that was built by the client and deeded to the city, and so the means of our town is completely broke. They have no money to build the shortest street. And so Kimley Horn, in paying for this road, gets to use it for parking during the daytime, and then they let the public park there at night. It's a means by which the super blocks of Miracle Mile might possibly be broken up. If you extended this over the entirety of Miracle Mile, it would be 1.5 miles of privately financed roads. Okay? I'm going to do this really quickly, but the cost of this project had to be very economical. And so around $100 a square foot. And We looked at two models. One of them were the buildings that we knew from having done work at the University of Miami campus, Marion, Manlius buildings. And although these suggest that they make good outdoor spaces, they didn't always. In fact, they often didn't make very good spaces on the campus. These were done in about 1949. At about the same time at Harvard, the Architects Collaborative was using similarly simple and extruded buildings to design dormitories. And here, what they managed to do was make a decent streetscape, make decent courtyards, and provide for interesting passage between and through the courtyards in this area right here. So we wanted to have the urbanity of Harvard's housing, and we wanted to have the economy of Marion Manley's housing at the University of Miami. This is the landscape architect's studio, probably the glam room on the campus. This is the parking garage, which you have to be able to see. This is part of the first phase building. This is structured water storage. This is the street that Kimley Horn built at their own cost and then deeded to the city. In the middle of the campus is the central plant, and it's hiding one of the ends of the parking garage that is just to the west of it. And then these are renderings of the second and third phase, which has not been realized at this point, but I wanted you to see the scale. These are relatively simple and extruded buildings. The simplicity has to be masked if they're going to be fun to walk through. So we did ask that, like the Harvard project, that they help with the rudiments of streetscapes, that they form courtyards, that they form connections from one interior block space to the next. You can see that the courtyards are relatively small, but that every office has a garden to look upon. So when you have an onerous height limit, the temptation is usually to do all the buildings as high as possible, which reduces the site coverage. We did something a little bit different. We increased the site coverage so that you could have a little bit of a roofscape here, so that you could have the occasional 1-, 2-story buildings as well as the 3-story buildings. This is essentially the gate to the second phase campus as you see it from the street that Kimley Horn built through the site. And then other views of courtyards, just to give you a sense of the scale. Last project. I had mentioned condominiums somewhat disparagingly earlier, and if they haven't completely diminished the state of Florida, they certainly haven't done enough positive to make the state a nicer place. They're not a building type that is going to go away, and I think they can be done better. And so part of the point of this project was to do condominiums that rose to a higher standard. One of my favorite forms of housing are the garden apartments that were built in the 1920s in Queens, and mostly in Jackson Heights. And those garden apartments made beautiful streets, and they gave each of the residents beautiful courtyards to look on in the middle of a busy city. They are virtually impossible to approach anymore in their quality for two reasons. One, they all predate the requirement for a second means of egress. They had ladder-like fire stairs on them. Now that you need to have two means of egress, it's much more common to have long hallways. And so one of the things that made those apartments appealing was that they were built around cores. The second thing that makes it impossible to do those anymore, of course, are off-street parking requirements. So the premise of this project was to try and do condominiums that would, as much as possible, approach the quality of the garden apartments that were done in Queens in the 1920s. This is a site on the Indian River estuary. It's on the very edge of Windsor and the logical extent of building. After this site, you go into the estuary here. Actually, it's near Pelican Island, which Teddy Roosevelt declared a wildlife preserve in 1903, our country's first. These are two condominium projects that are within 2 miles of the project that I'm trying to describe to you. The photograph on the left shows condominiums along the Indian River, and the photograph on the right shows them along the Atlantic Ocean. You can see that the form that they take is similar. They're roughly 80 by 80 buildings because it's the most efficient way to get 2 large apartment units per floor and have a high net to gross ratio. Just an incredibly studied building type, but not particularly nice. You can either line them up like soldiers or you can checkerboard them, and I don't see them checkerboarded very often. So we had a parcel that's roughly 1 acre in Windsor, And we studied it 3 different ways. We studied it as standard condominiums. And so this top diagram shows how the site would be developed for 12 units if you did the standard condominium. And there's plenty of room to just line up 3 of those sort of lumpen square buildings along where the views are the best. We studied it a few years ago as fee simple row houses or townhouses, and we created this sort of checkerboard which alternated between parking access here and here and sort of semi-public gardens here. And then Windsor finally decided that what they wanted to do was a bunch of flats or condominiums. And so the final form of it, as it's being built, is this, which goes just is the slightly higher site coverage. But the checkerboarding of the site, which was evident in the second study, is more fully developed here. So you have, by the way, the off-street parking requirements here are 2 per unit, so they're somewhat onerous. The parking courts are big here and here, and then there's a series of semi-public gardens that run up and down the middle. And furthermore, there's a sort of nascent square across the street, and we have to turn the outer courts towards that square without diminishing it. This is a site plan that shows its relationship to the Indian River at the top, the semi-public gardens, the outer courts here and here, and the square that's across the street. This larger plan just shows the further developments of the units with eyes towards, frankly, views. This is a rendering of what the complex looks like from over the park, looking over towards the Indian River estuary. A detail of the parking court, carefully masked from the park across the street. And then this is the semi-public garden that opens to the wetlands to the west. And so that's our version of condominiums. One of the things that we did do is we looked at a way of using similar buildings to go ahead and try and complete the square with a building here and here. Simply the middle building flipped so that you couldn't see the competition. And I think more interestingly, taking the same types of buildings and simply butterflying them on a standard large square Midwestern lot and having an alley serve the 4 outer courts here and then having a series of semi-public spaces traversable here. So I just wanted to see whether or not what we were working with at Windsor would be, whether it would be transferable to a city block. And that's why that diagram was done. That's all I have to show you. One of the things that I would say is that I know some of you are graduating. Most of you are working very hard this week. I hope you will take the time to get some sleep. For those of you who are graduating, I wish you the best of luck on your thesis project next semester. Graduate, go forth with courage and curiosity. There will be those of us who are going to be able to continue to teach you and offer you encouragement and keep you between the shoulders of the road and out of the ditches. So go forth with courage. Thanks. So I think Michael fired a shot across the bow of the students at the beginning of this and had asked that if you had any questions, and certainly I didn't make everything clear in that 440 sprint. If you have any questions about anything that I brought up during the course of the last hour, I would be more than happy to entertain questions about the projects or anything I said at the beginning. Yes?
Has the ride-sharing culture with Lyft and Uber begun to affect the parking ratios in Florida at all?
I'm sorry, Matt.
Has the ride-sharing culture with Uber and Lyft and other such things begun to affect the number of parking units per unit, parking stalls per unit in Florida?
Not yet. Other things have. I mean, but even before, first of all, Uber doesn't have much of a presence in the town where we live. I think it's inevitable that people will be thinking about that. I don't really know on the whole how much benefit. There will be things going in both directions. There will be kids who aren't of driving age taking Uber cars as well. So some of the benefits will be offset, I think. But the planning department in Bureau Beach has come to the conclusion, or did come to the conclusion years ago, that places like Miracle Mile were overparked at 5 spaces per 1,000 for offices and mixed use. So those numbers have been coming down for reasons other than Uber. I can't really begin to get a sense of how Uber is going to affect parking requirements, but it's definitely on everybody's mind. It just takes a little while for all these things to filter their way down to the level of Vero Beach. It's not really, it hasn't really been thought through rigorously in Vero Beach yet. It's inevitable, Matt. It will, but I can't tell you how it's going to affect it. What I'm actually more interested in is the trigger point, and I'm not a developer, but I'm more interested in the trigger point at which a place like Miracle-Mile can actually rationalize more parking garages. So, you know, it's beyond my capacity to be able to figure out with the differential and the cost between the two types of parking, what is going to trigger more parking garages in a place like Vero Beach, which I think they probably ultimately need. It's a hard pill to swallow, but it's the only way I think you're going. We have a love and a respect for openness and green spaces, and I think parking garages are going to be one of the few means by which the openness that we so value is going to be possible, especially with land prices as high as they are. So I don't know whether upzoning will help hasten more parking garages or not.
Robotic cars.
What's that?
Robotic cars.
Robotic cars?
We'll wipe out parking garages in 45 years.
45 years in Vero Beach. Okay, give us a, we're just sort of a heartbeat behind everybody else. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
And what sources of influence do you have for your Middle Eastern work, since it's not your... What sources of influence or inspiration do you have for your Middle Eastern work? Because it's not your hometown anymore. What you're doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are cultural impediments to picking up and presuming to work on the other side of the world. And I understand, I'm humble about the impediments. In fact, they have been our undoing on occasion as well. In terms of the inspiration, I had made mention of the fact during the comments that this was as close as I had ever come to having to, or getting to start from scratch. And I would say the Arabian Peninsula is probably more in need of good precedents than any place I can think of. And whether that's discouraging or liberating, I guess depends on how you look at it. I have found it so intoxicating that things are so fluid and still so wide open. But it means that you can develop something that's almost a rational language based on real things like parking policies and cross-ventilation and envelope efficiencies. The language of the walls themselves are a function of, you know, energy transfer and things like that. But mostly we looked at privacy, views, and light and air and things like that. So, I mean, they're the very same things. I talked about ideas that were transferable and those that aren't transferable. One of the reasons why I was so interested in the Middle East work is because despite the fact that it was at a remove, it seemed to be so similar to so many of the problems that we were dealing with in the United States. I mentioned that one building type being well suited to Miami Beach, but I've also discussed the fact that some of the policy problems that you encounter in Al Ain are the very same policy problems that we have in Vero Beach. And so while there are, on the surface, these cultural differences that you have to be very careful about and very humble about, there's also incredible similarities between the problems that are shared between my town and very remote places. I felt like I was going halfway across the world to work on problems that were in my own backyard, which is why in the end I was so happy for the opportunity to study a building on the edge of Miracle-Mile. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Does it? Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. You were speaking about ION in Charleston, and some of us are here from Charleston, South Carolina, and beyond architecture, I wanted to ask you about a concern that I feel like most architects don't really take into account, and that's like social justice. So if you've been to ION, you understand that it's kind of a social monoculture there, and as good as the urbanism is, and as pretty good as the architecture is, when you go to these places, you feel that, you know? Mm-hmm. So it seems that you have experience all over the world, and I wonder if you see other cities handling that kind of social justice situation through architecture in a successful way. Because that's one thing we don't see in Charleston.
Okay, I can outdo the monoculture of Ion by citing other places that I have done a lot of work repeatedly. And my feeling about this is that you often need places where you can experiment. And I've always thought that Windsor, which is a place where I've been working for 25 years at this point, is an enviable opportunity to try and experiment. For one thing, you're not experimenting on people of limited means, but you can experiment with one type of problem or another without harming anybody. Also, a place like Windsor is given great latitude precisely because it's a prosperous place. The project that I showed is denser, believe it or not, than anything that would be allowed in Vero Beach. Progress is very slow. You have to take the long view. And I really think that a place like Windsor or Ion, whether or not those are ever important projects is going to depend on what kinds of ideas they make possible in other places. Okay, so I wouldn't worry about the short term. I wouldn't worry about the monoculture. I would look at those as opportunities to experiment and try and solve certain problems. There's no question there's a limit in how many people's lives you can affect. I had said you do whatever you can. I also said it's never enough. But you shouldn't shy away, I think, from experimenting on places that are like Ion or Windsor, because that's not the end goal. The end goal is to use them to improve less fortunate places. Is that a satisfactory answer? No, I'm serious. I just want to know if I addressed your question.
No, not at all.
Okay.
I'm a fifth-year student, about ready to graduate, and we've been hearing a lot of advice, kind of from
Can you speak up? I apologize.
Oh, sorry. So as fifth years, we've been hearing a lot of advice from architects who come and lecture. I think I just found your story interesting. Some will say, like, go home, go to your hometown and work there. Whereas you kind of found a lot of success when you went to a place you described as the edge of the world. So I guess personally, why Seaside? Like, why did you choose that project? And then more, I guess, broad view, how should a young architect decide who or what to work for, what projects?
Okay, well, a couple of ways to answer your question. First of all, you can only address the possibilities that present themselves to you. And so one reason why my wife and I went to Seaside is because the opportunity arose. Andreas made introductions, and I was able to go there and work. So some of it is serendipitous, right? Now, in terms of whether or not you go back to your hometown or whether you go someplace remote, I'll only give you the benefit of what my wife and I did, which was that there's a lot of schools in the Northeast. There's a lot of graduates in the Northeast. There's a lot of firms in the Northeast. And when you go to the edge of the world, as I was describing it, it's almost like a frontier. There's a lot of things to be designed and built and a lot of problems to be solved. And oftentimes there's not enough people to solve them. The theory was that we would go to Seaside for a very short period of time and come back to the Northeast. It just didn't happen that way. But I think for us it generally worked out well to go someplace where there was a shortage of energy and talent and ambition. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be the right thing for everybody. I mean, there is no one right answer. For us, I think it worked out really well to leave the Northeast and go to the frontier. I think for some of you, and I see this particularly in your student projects, it's so moving to come and see you working in your own hometowns where there's familiarity, the opposite of the problem of not knowing a different culture, because cultures change from state to state as well as from continent to continent. But some people have to go back to their hometowns and others have to go to parts of the country that are underserved. You know, whether it's doctors or architects, there are congregations of people generally living and working in the places where the quality of life is assumed to be good. But I mean, this is going to be true of everybody. Everybody can't congregate in half a dozen cities. I mean, it's just impossible. That's the short-term phenomenon. In the long run, people are going to have to leave Boston and New York, San Francisco, and they're going to have to go to Oklahoma City or Tulsa or other places like that. So whether those are their hometowns or whether those are the frontiers for them, I mean, I think both moves are completely legitimate. Okay? Mr. Best.
I'm quite enamored of the drawing on the right.
Of the what?
The drawing on the right.
Oh, that's still up? I thought it went to a blank screen.
And I just have a couple of questions. One is about the size of the block, and the other, actually 3 questions. One is the size of the block. One is whether all of the parking is because it was one.
It was 2 per unit.
It's
These
2.
are large units.
Okay, so is all, okay, so but is all the parking accommodated in the courts? Okay, and so then the third question is, from that, what kind of density do you get per acre? Well,
Okay.
because I'm speculating that's 2.5 acres.
What I do is I butterfly a 1 acre site.
A 1
Okay, so
acre.
let's say it's about 2 acres.
Okay.
Now, when I said it was a big Midwestern block, it's really probably about 300 feet on the inside.
Yeah.
So I don't know, was that make it 360 to the center line?
Center line, yeah.
That's a pretty big block.
Yeah.
Listen, I was trying to take an idea from Windsor and apply it to a different situation. If I had to shrink it 10%, I'm not sure it would materially change the solution. Okay, and what I was curious about was, I told you that what I was trying to do, I was comparing to something in a street system. You know, Roosevelt Avenue, the 80s or whatever in Jackson Heights. And I was just curious about whether something, this goes back in a way to other questions somebody else asked before. Windsor is not really a remarkable project unless it helps, it's disseminated, some of the ideas are disseminated. All I wanted to do is see if something that was possible with Windsor's considerable means would be possible within a fairly normal, large Midwestern block. So, look, it's not perfect, but I'm pretty happy with the quality that these units afford the people who are in them. Now, with the Windsor program, the units are incredibly large, which is why there's 2 spaces per unit. I've done exercises for each building where we have the number of units, and then the units become more like 2-bedroom units. And you could double the units and cut in half the off-street parking requirement, and you would have exactly what's in the drawing on the right. Does that get to your question?
Yeah, I mean, all that I think is terrific. I'm just curious about what the actual dimensions were and what you were looking at. So obviously the density can vary depending upon what size of the unit you make it. And but I was just but all the buildings are dwelling units, and it looks like half of a Chicago block.
Okay, well, look, you and I have been talking about this for years. We've been talking about the impossibility of building the garden apartments, right? So maybe at some point you provoked me into trying to prove that, you know, come close to those buildings.
I mean, I think that you handled, I mean, the fact that all the parking is accommodated there is, that's why I'm particularly enamored of the drawing. We have some actually I had this, well.
Okay, so I can't say any density you want. Obviously, you increase the density and it's a more real-world thing. The problem with going from Windsor anywhere is it's not a real-world problem. It's more real-world to the degree that you bring the unit sizes way, way down. And obviously, it's not just a matter of doubling the units because you're going to incur hallways. And as you incur hallways, some of the things that are really nice about these buildings, remember I said the buildings at Alice Beach were double-loaded and cross-ventilated and everything. So these
Well, when
buildings...
you say double-loaded, you mean they have a center stair.
Center hall.
Center hall, yeah.
Right, so, but when in some ways, the unreality of the pre-recession Alice stuff that I was talking about is true of this building, of these buildings, in that they're all through units because they're on very inefficient cores. So what happens is you decrease the number of cores, you introduce hallways, and the cross ventilation that you have in this model then goes out the window, right?
Goes out the window.
Okay, so you know you can approach it, but you can't get there. All right. What else? Michael.
I'll try to, I have 2 questions, and I'll try to link them into one. I was very impressed with the work that you've done at both at Alice Beach and the United Arab Emirates. And it has some of the central quality of the early moderns, like Cord, but also the industrial tactility of the Van Nel building we were talking about, the Van Nel factory. But it has a domestic scale. It's been altered. It's learned. It's absorbed all these different qualities from different places. There's a kind of universality about those buildings, but they're also very rooted in place. So that it goes. I just am making a comment more on that, which you talked about the fact all the different dimensions of us as humans and our faults, our good qualities, and it seemed to me that those buildings have also taken on aspects which are universal, aspects which are specific from different periods of history, and really weave them into a seamless composition and kit of parts, for lack of a better word, that's pretty elegant. Now, one of the things that our students are seeing, and I've been asked this many times, is we are living right now on the precipice of what we feel is dramatic change. That's in the air everywhere. And we talked last night, after I picked you up at the airport, about the importance of not just designing for the 1%, which is what architects have gravitated towards with increasing speed over the past 2-3 decades. So how can we take those experiments that you were talking about at Windsor, the experiments, for lack of a better word, in the United Arab Emirates, how can we apply those to a practice which will engage more than the 1%? How do we engage the 90%?
Thanks for a really small, unchallenging question. Well, first of all, let me point out that I also talked about engaging more building types than what we are normally trained to entertain. So before we even get to how do you make housing affordable for more people, you can at least go to my contention that we ought to be designing the types of buildings that you had at Miracle Mile, the central plant and so on. I didn't show you another project that we're working on with Dpz because I can't, but it addresses big boxes and the really kind of retail aspect of a really major arterial retail program that's very difficult to wrestle down. So I think there's that, where we can work on more building types. We can improve the ground plane. I really do believe that beautiful parking lots are terribly important, that beautiful water storage is important. In terms of surface area, that's really incredibly important. In terms of how do you go further and further down in cost of construction, I went to visit a charrette that Dpz was doing in Huntsville, and I was impressed with the fact that Dpz is the only firm I know of that is trying to look at the cheapest possible form of housing for the equivalent of, what is that big housing company down there? They have been looking at how many stories can they do with a single means of egress, and they have been looking at envelope efficiency. And so you have these 3-story square buildings that are not incredibly elegant, but are so beautiful in terms of their aspirations to build 4 nice corner units per floor at the best possible cost. Important, because that's the homeowner. So, but I show up in this incredibly depressing convention hotel, and Dpz is there, and they're trying to do it. They're trying to figure out how to bring the costs lower and lower and lower. So, I mean, if the students want to find examples of this, Dpz is doing great work. And I'm impressed when I see it, that I don't see it at enough firms. I mean, we certainly don't do enough of it.
How do you integrate the landscape architecture aspect with your investigations and proposals?
I prefer to sort of structure the site because if you think about the office complex that has the small courtyards in Vero Beach, there's not a single square foot of land that's very far from the building. And so it's very difficult to beg the question of what the ground plane looks like. So the structure where the sidewalks are, or where there are retaining walls, even where the water should be stored, all these things are questions that I think are at a point where maybe you're passing off to the landscape consultant, but it's something that both parties should be involved with, for sure. I mean, Andreas talks a lot about the ground plane.
Right.
And I mean, by that he means hard surfaces like parking lots, and he means also trees. And this is an incredibly important thing, but I think it sort of falls like in the seam of the defense. You know, it's somewhere between one person's responsibilities and another, and those types of things often get dropped because neither party picks them up. But it's something that both parties should be involved in, and you should just figure out the point at which you pass the baton. That is something that can be dialed back and forth between the two parties. But all this talk about the ground plane is an extremely important concept. Okay. Yes?
Yeah, what is the role of durability playing in design? You're talking about the craftsmanship of your early work, you know, kind of the backyard projects that you were trying to step away from, maybe the 1%er projects, but now you're talking about also bringing down the cost of the units with Dpz. And are you hoping that the actual design of the structures, you know, you were talking about the problems in Florida with spalling, with moisture and all these other things. Is there a threshold that you're saying, hey, I want my building to last X, you know, the next 100 years, I want this facade to frame this, or, you know, to enforce this street?
Well, it's an agonizing problem, but the worst thing is to think that they're in opposition to one another. So, I mean, everybody deserves durability. And it's not something that belongs exclusively to the better building types or the higher cost per square foot. I mean, you've got to figure out how to bring durability down at as low cost as possible. As I said, you have to bring as many people along with you as possible, and you can't do that at very high cost per square foot. But you also can't bring square footage costs down by making them less impervious to water or whatever. So I think it's a huge problem to think that they're in opposition to one another. I mean, there are obviously tensions between the two, but they're not by any means exclusive of one another. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but that's the best I can do. Okay.
Yes, I don't know whether I should open my mouth, of course, but I'm getting a little bit worried about a certain lack of regionalism that I've been seeing in some of your buildings. To wit, you know, in Panama studios, Trinidad studios, and things like that, high rainfall areas have overhangs, and stucco can get moldy, and putting white stucco beside retention ponds may not be the best way to conceptualize Florida mosquitoes and the swampiness of the environment, you know. And it seems that Jeddah does have precedent.
Jeddah does have
Really fantastic precedent, actually. You know what I mean? And your building is actually, they're better integrated with, I mean, I've worked there, with what's happening locally. But I'm worried about whether the enterprise of finding a Florida architecture is proceeding.
Whether
The enterprise of finding a Florida architecture, culturally and environmentally, is receding in your work.
I'm trying to think. Do you want to talk about an example like eaves? Because you talked about throwing water.
The
off
white
the top
walls,
of the
rain falling on white walls.
Yeah.
You know, what happens to that?
Okay.
What happens to the stucco, whether, you know, what additive you use?
That's a fair question, but let me give you two things that I have to deal with. In both the office complex in Vero Beach and at Alice Beach, we have height limits where they're described in such a way that they punish you. They're punitive in terms of pitched roofs. And so the economic incentive is to do a flat roof building. If you don't do a flat roof building, you're leaving, to use a vulgar term, money on the table. Okay, so what does one do in a situation like that? Does one pursue eaves and roofs and a regional vernacular at all costs? I don't think so. I mean, it would be untenable for me to be able to do that work at Alice without it having a flat roof on it. And the same thing with the onerous height limits at Miracle Mile, which are 35 feet tall. If the zoning didn't punish you for doing a pitched roof, it would be a different matter. Then you could talk about the cost of the eaves, which are considerable. So, I'm not dismissing your concerns, Douglas, but a large part of the budget is in the eaves.
No, I'm being impractical, but here's a winter lesson that has not been transferred to downtown.
To downtown Vero Beach. Yeah, I mean, we're building at a fraction of the cost in downtown Vero Beach. A fraction of the cost. And so, I mean, it's an important question for everybody to say, how much forgiveness is there? I think I used the phrase that from conventional formal standards, that some of this work was going to be less satisfying. And I think maybe what your reaction to it is maybe proof or example of that. But there's lots of times when I don't have any choice but to do a flat roof. And it could be for one or two very good reasons. And then Douglas, every time you're making a decision about whether you spend extra money on an assembly like the eaves, you have to weigh that against whether or not that additional cost in pursuit of what regionalism is a luxury when you're considering that every marginal cost puts housing or whatever building type you're working on just that much further out of reach of somebody who's just barely on the threshold of being able to afford housing. So you can look at it in isolation and you can talk about the potential loss of regionalism, or you can look at it in the context of moving money from one part of the project to something else.
There's a post-Great Recession world that I'm just beginning to wake up to. Let's just put it that way.
Well, I mean, it goes
A big
beyond.
corridor, a big apartment house, I haven't been squeezed by it.
Well, I mean, that's just the beginning of it. Douglas, there are other things that you would find intolerable, like artificial stucco and stucco joints. And the other things that follow in the wake of the recession is that insurance companies are now telling us more about how to build a building. You know, I mean, I think that might be a bigger problem than the one that you cite, and it would be a harder one to stomach. And trust me, Eric and Marion and our office have been in the heat of discussing these very issues. So sometimes it's a budget, and sometimes it's issues of durability or insurability that snatch the regional vernacular from you. I mean, you still see it in the Windsor project, Douglas, right?
Yeah,
I mean, so
right,
we do it
very much.
where we can.
No, like I say, I'm still waking up to the squeeze.
Yeah, I think we're all still trying to figure out exactly what happened during the course of the recession and the best way to react to it. Often pretty subtle trade-offs, so you know. Stephanie?
Can you speak more about the architectural influences on the community foreign office campus? How you came to that?
The influences?
Yeah.
Well, the dean at the University of Miami School of Architecture, Liz Platter-Zyber, had us down there twice working on, one was Leon Cruz Hall, and then we did a master plan for the precinct for the School of Architecture. Now, that's how I became familiar with Marion Manley's extruded buildings. I showed you a slide that had some of her buildings on the right side. Those are what I call the simple extruded buildings from the late 1940s. I had recourse to that because it was cheap. Let's say inexpensive. Okay? And I very much had that in mind, but I feel like Marion Manley, the language was promising, but it was not fully developed. And I thought there was every possibility for modest expression of sectional changes, and I thought the window groups could be much more varied than they were. And as I said, I thought that they could also be asked to perform the rudimentary tasks of making blocks and courtyards. And so Marion Manley's was just, you know, sort of, it was the promise of that language at a relatively inexpensive cost that I found interesting and helpful. I've talked before about other traditions in Florida that offer promise but still haven't developed to the degree that they could. In the same breath as Marion Manley's buildings, I often mention Clouthot's buildings in Jacksonville, which was like Frank Lloyd Wright, Douglas would love the Clouthieu stuff because it was taking prairie style language and bringing it to a portion of the country where it could have been a really remarkable subtropical language. And then the other one that I like is the stuff that Paul Rudolph did over in Sarasota, which are those little frame stick-like buildings that hover above the mangroves. And I've looked at that for projects outside of Florida, but not for Florida itself. So anyway, for the Kimley-Horn buildings, it was Marion Manlius stuff, most of which has been torn down at this point. The School of Architecture expressed at one time a great love of those buildings and appreciation for them. I know that when we were working with Leon, that he hated the buildings. I also know that Vince loved them, right? So there you have it. I don't know what kind of relative weight do we put on the scales for those two conclusions. I admire them a great deal. I wouldn't want to have to renovate them. Right? Okay, Stephanie? Yes?
Yeah, so let's say you've done your experimentations and you've learned your lessons, you've pushed your ideas out into the world. Let's say maybe even you satisfied Douglas and Professor Bess and figured out how to do the blog. And now your goal is to get enough people to listen to you so that it's not just you and your firm doing these things in delightful but limited ways, as much as a single firm or a single person can do. How do you get people to listen to you?
So, Michael, your question looks easy now. I'm not sure how to answer your question.
Okay.
Personally, I think that example is powerful. I have a very high percentage of unbuilt projects tonight because I think unbuilt projects are incredibly important. And I don't know what can be more eloquent than an example. I don't think an argument can be more compelling than a good example. And so I think in the end, the best form of rhetoric is examples of what it is that you're trying to describe with words. Does that come close to answering your question?
It's helpful, thank you.
Okay. What else, you guys?
I think we talked about.
I had an hour and a half interview with Stephanie before this, and I thought I was going to lose my voice. Okay? Very good. You guys got it?